The airport was already crowded when he walked in. People were rushing in every direction, dragging suitcases, checking phones, standing in long lines with tired expressions on their faces. Business travelers in clean suits, families with matching travel pillows, college students laughing too loudly. It was the usual early morning chaos. Then he stepped through the sliding doors. He didn't move fast like the others. He walked slowly, steady, like someone who had nowhere to rush to and nothing to prove. His boots were heavy and worn. His jeans were faded from years of use. Over his shoulders rested a thick leather jacket, dark and slightly cracked with age. On the back were patches stitched carefully into place. Not flashy, not shiny, just there. His beard was rough and full. His hands looked strong, the kind of hands shaped by years of real work. A small duffel bag hung from his shoulder. It looked older than most of the travelers in the building. Some people noticed him right away. A woman standing near the coffee shop nudged the man beside her and whispered something. A teenager stared a little too long before quickly looking away. A man in a suit glanced at the jacket patches and gave a small smirk. It wasn't loud. No one said anything directly to him, but the look said enough. He didn't seem to care. He walked toward the check-in counter, stood quietly in line, and waited his turn. While others tapped their feet impatiently or complained about delays, he simply stood there, eyes calm, posture straight. When it was his turn, the airline employee greeted him with a polite but slightly unsure smile. She glanced at his appearance, then at his ticket. Her eyes flicked back to the ticket again. "First class?" she asked, almost without meaning to. He nodded once. "That's right." Her tone changed slightly. "Of course, sir. Boarding begins in about 30 minutes. He thanked her and stepped aside. In the waiting area, the first class section was filled with quiet conversations and the soft tapping of laptop keys. He took a seat near the window. The chair creaked slightly under his weight. Across from him, two businessmen spoke in low voices. One of them looked over at the biker and raised an eyebrow. "Interesting choice for first class," he muttered. The other gave a quiet chuckle. The biker heard it. Of course he did, but his face didn't change. He simply looked out at the runway where planes were landing and taking off against the pale morning sky. Boarding was announced soon after. Passengers lined up according to their groups. When first class was called, he stood and joined the short line. The woman scanning boarding passes smiled politely at the others. When she saw him, her smile paused for just a second before returning. She scanned his pass. "Enjoy your flight," she said. He nodded once and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, soft lighting and wide seats welcomed first-class passengers. A flight attendant stood near the entrance, greeting everyone. "Welcome aboard," she said warmly to the couple ahead of him. Then she saw him. Her eyes briefly moved over the leather jacket, the boots, the patches. She hesitated just slightly. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" He handed it to her, without a word. She looked at it carefully, then handed it back. "Seat 2A, just to your left." He walked down the short aisle. Conversations quieted for a moment as he passed. He placed his duffel bag gently in the overhead compartment and took the window seat. A man sitting across the aisle leaned toward his companion. "This should be interesting," he whispered. The biker buckled his seatbelt and rested his hands on his knees. As more passengers boarded, the quiet whispers continued. Some were curious. Some were judgmental. A few simply stared. He didn't scroll through a phone. He didn't open a laptop. He just watched the activity outside the window as ground crew prepared the aircraft. A young flight attendant approached with a tray of drinks. "Would you like something before takeoff?" she asked. "Water is fine," he replied calmly. His voice surprised her. It was steady, clear, not rough or careless like she might have expected. She handed him the glass and moved on. Across the aisle, one of the businessmen ordered sparkling water and made a small comment loud enough to be heard. "Guess first class is open to everyone these days." A quiet laugh followed. The biker took a slow sip of his water and said nothing. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the speaker, welcoming everyone on board and explaining the flight time. The usual safety instructions followed. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. As it picked up speed, Some passengers gripped their armrests. Others closed their eyes. The biker remained still, looking straight ahead. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing into the sky. Once they reached cruising altitude, seatbelt signs turned off and light conversations resumed. Laptops opened. Snacks were served. The man across the aisle couldn't seem to stop glancing at the biker jacket. "What are those patches anyway?" he finally asked, unable to hold back his curiosity. The biker looked at him calmly. "Old memories," he replied. The answer was simple. No extra details. The businessman waited for more, but nothing else came. "Motorcycle club?" the man pressed, smiling slightly as if expecting a dramatic story. The biker shook his head once. No, that was all he said. The conversation died quickly after that. The businessman leaned back in his seat, slightly annoyed at not getting the reaction he expected. An hour passed peacefully. Clouds stretched endlessly outside the window. The cabin felt calm, almost sleepy. The biker closed his eyes for a moment, not fully asleep, just resting. His breathing was slow and steady. A child from a few rows back walked toward the front with his mother. The little boy stared at the biker's jacket with wide eyes. "Are you a superhero?" the boy asked suddenly. His mother looked embarrassed. "I'm so sorry." The biker smiled gently, the first real expression anyone had seen from him. "No," he said softly, "just someone who likes to ride." The boy looked disappointed, but still impressed. "Cool jacket. Thank you." The mother gave him a grateful nod before guiding her son back to their seats. For a brief moment, the tension around him softened, but not everyone let it go. The businessman across the aisle leaned toward his friend again. "Superhero biker in first class," he whispered with a smirk. The friend shook his head, amused. The biker turned back to the window. Far below, the world looked small. Roads like thin lines. Buildings like tiny blocks. Up here, things were quiet. Simple. He adjusted his jacket slightly. Underneath the leather, barely visible unless someone looked closely, was a small metal pin fastened near the collar. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't flashy. It was worn, like everything else he carried. But it meant something. No one in the cabin noticed it. Not yet. A flight attendant passed by again, offering warm towels. When she reached him, her eyes lingered on the patches a little longer than before. "Have we met before?" she asked carefully. He looked at her for a second. His eyes were sharp but kind. "I don't think so." She nodded, slightly unsure why she had asked. As she walked away, she glanced back once more. Something about him felt different, not dangerous, not reckless, just steady. The kind of steady that doesn't come easily. The plane continued forward through the sky, engines humming steadily. Passengers relaxed more. Some removed their shoes. Others watched movies. The earlier whispers faded into background noise, but a strange feeling hung quietly in the air, as if something unexpected was waiting just ahead. The biker looked down at his hands for a moment. There were faint scars along his knuckles, thin lines that told stories without words. He flexed his fingers slowly, then rested them again. Across the aisle, the businessman had finally lost interest and returned to his laptop. The judgment had faded into boredom. Outside the window, clouds began to thicken. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane entered a patch of darker sky. The seatbelt sign flickered on. A small bump shook the aircraft. Nothing serious. Just a reminder that even at 30,000 feet, things can change in an instant. The biker opened his eyes fully now, his attention shifting. He didn't look nervous. He looked aware. And while most passengers assumed this would be just another routine flight, none of them had any idea that the quiet man in the leather jacket would soon become the most important person on that plane. But for now, he simply sat there, calm and unnoticed, as the aircraft continued forward into thickening clouds. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour. The clouds stretched endlessly beneath the wings, painted in shades of gray and white as the morning sun struggled to break through. Most passengers had relaxed by now. Some dozed lightly. Others worked quietly on their laptops, and a few watched movies with headphones snug over their ears. The initial murmurs and curious glances at the biker had faded, replaced by the steady hum of the engines and soft chatter. Then it happened. A sudden jolt shook the aircraft. The passengers gasped and gripped their armrests. A cup of coffee tumbled from the tray table of a nearby woman and splashed onto her lap. The overhead bins rattled slightly. A sharp noise of metal scraping against metal echoed softly in the cabin. The plane lurched again, more violently this time, and the lights flickered. The initial reactions were small, but growing. A few passengers muttered worriedly. A young man sitting near the middle of the plane stood abruptly, clinging to the back of a seat, his face pale. Just turbulence, a voice tried to reassure. It was probably the man's companion, but their words sounded hollow even to them. Another jolt came, sharper, and a collective shiver passed through the cabin. The child, several rows back, began crying. The mother tried to soothe him, her voice trembling slightly. Even the flight attendants, who were trained to appear calm no matter the situation, exchanged small glances that betrayed unease. The captain's voice finally came over the intercom. Calm, controlled, but there was a tension beneath the tone that everyone could feel. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The passengers obeyed, some more anxiously than others. But it wasn't just turbulence. Something was wrong. The plane felt heavier in its movements, less responsive. The usual smooth hum of the engine seemed irregular, like a heartbeat that skipped a beat and then caught itself again. The man in the leather jacket didn't flinch. He sat upright, his hands resting calmly on his knees. His eyes scanned the cabin, noticing who was nervous, who was trying to hide their fear, and who was silently panicking. His gaze then shifted forward, toward the cockpit, as if he could already see the challenges unfolding up there. A minute later, the captain's voice came again, firmer this time. We have a technical issue affecting our navigation system. Assistance is required. Is there anyone on board with advanced flight experience, specifically military combat training? The cabin fell silent. Every head turned toward the man in the leather jacket almost instinctively. Some passengers exchanged confused glances. A few laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. The man remained still. No one had expected him to react immediately. They continued whispering amongst themselves. What does he mean? Combat training? One passenger asked, his voice tight with curiosity and growing fear. I don't know, another replied. Maybe a former pilot? Still, the man did nothing for several long seconds. He simply looked out the window, as if watching the clouds move in slow motion. But behind those calm eyes was a mind analyzing, calculating, preparing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stood. His movements were smooth, confident, and unhurried, like a man who had faced real danger before and knew exactly how to handle it. The flight attendant who was passing down the aisle froze when she saw him. His presence alone seemed to command authority, even without words. She took a cautious step toward him. Sir, are you? She began, uncertain. He nodded once. I can help. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside and motioned him toward the cockpit. Passengers craned their necks to watch. Some whispers started again, but now the tone had changed. The laughter and judgment from earlier had shifted to quiet awe and nervous curiosity. As he moved forward, he reached into the inside pocket of his leather jacket and pulled out a small identification card. He handed it to the flight attendant. Her eyes widened slightly as she read it. You were in the military? She asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded. His calm, steady demeanor left no room for questions. The flight attendant handed the card back, nodded, and led him to the cockpit. Inside, the captain looked tense. He was tall, with streaks of gray in his hair and eyes that showed both experience and concern. The co-pilot fidgeted nervously with some of the controls. Good to see you, the captain said curtly. We've got a system malfunction affecting navigation. The turbulence is making it worse. Can you assist? The biker nodded. Yes, let's take a look. He moved to the controls with the familiarity of someone who had done this hundreds, maybe thousands of times. His hands were steady, precise. He didn't fumble or hesitate. He immediately assessed the instruments, noted the irregular readings, and began working with the captain to stabilize the plane. Back in the cabin, the passengers could feel the change. The plane's movement became more controlled, less erratic. The jittery whispers died down. Some people stared forward, unsure what was happening. The man who had been nervous before gripped his armrest, then slowly relaxed as the plane leveled slightly. The child who had been crying earlier quieted in his mother's arms. She glanced toward the cockpit, sensing that something had shifted, though she didn't understand exactly what. A man sitting across the aisle leaned toward a companion and whispered, "Who is he? How is he doing that?" "I don't know," the companion replied, voice low, "but I think he knows what he's doing." The flight attendants moved with more ease now. Their steps were purposeful but calm. They glanced back toward the cockpit, seeing the confidence in his movements and the way the captain now seemed to rely on him. The turbulence continued, but the panic had lessened. It wasn't gone completely, but the cabin felt more stable. The passengers still gripped their armrests, still whispered nervously, but there was an unspoken understanding that someone capable was at the controls. From his seat in the cockpit, the biker didn't need to speak loudly. Every action, every adjustment of the controls, communicated a sense of authority and control. The co-pilot watched in awe, taking cues from him, following his lead without hesitation. Outside, the clouds moved like a thick blanket. The sky was darkening as storm clouds began to gather. Lightning flashed in the distance, faint but ominous. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. The passengers, who had initially judged him for his rough appearance and casual demeanor, now silently observed. They realized their assumptions had been wrong. The man they thought was just a biker, a traveler like any other, was someone who had been trained for moments exactly like this. A mother clutched her child tightly, whispering a quiet prayer. A businessman who had earlier smirked at his jacket now stared with respect and a hint of guilt. People often underestimated others based on appearances. Today, they were learning the lesson firsthand. The plane jolted again, stronger this time, but the biker's hands moved smoothly over the instruments. He made a few quick calculations, adjusted a lever, and the plane steadied. The turbulence continued, but the erratic shaking subsided. The engine's hum became steady again. Passengers exchanged glances. Some whispered quietly, amazed. Others just sat still, gripping their seats, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The captain finally spoke over the intercom, his voice calmer now. "We have an experienced pilot assisting us. The situation is under control, but we ask that everyone remain seated with seatbelts fastened until further notice. Thank you for your patience." A wave of relief passed through the cabin. The initial fear had been replaced by cautious optimism. People began to breathe normally again, though eyes remained glued to the cockpit door. The biker remained focused. His eyes scanned the instruments, his hands moving confidently, his mind analyzing every detail. He didn't need to speak to assure the passengers. His presence alone was enough. The storm outside grew darker, rain falling harder, clouds twisting and churning. Yet inside the cabin, a quiet confidence settled. Passengers who'd been tense and scared now watched silently, learning something about courage and capability without words. The child looked up from his mother's arms, eyes wide. "Is he a hero?" he asked softly. The mother smiled gently, not taking her eyes off the cockpit. "Yes, in a way," she whispered. "Yes, he is." And in that moment, 30,000 feet above the ground, the man in the leather jacket showed everyone a simple truth. Appearances could be deceiving, and real strength often came in quiet, steady form. The plane continued its flight into the storm, turbulence still occasionally jarring, but no longer terrifying. The biker worked with calm precision, helping the captain guide the aircraft safely through the clouds. The passengers, once mocking and judgmental, now sat in quiet awe. What had begun as a routine flight had transformed into something unforgettable. The man they had quietly judged was no longer just a passenger. He was the one who might save them all. And for every person on that plane, the lesson was clear. Never underestimate someone based on how they look. Because sometimes, the person who seems ordinary is the one you'll need the most when the skies turn dark and uncertain. The storm was far from over. The journey was not yet complete. But with steady hands at the controls, the plane and its passengers had hope, real, tangible hope, that they would make it through the worst of it. The man in the leather jacket didn't speak. He didn't need to. His calm, quiet confidence was louder than any words. The passengers knew it. The crew knew it. And the storm outside, as powerful as it was, seemed just a little less intimidating with him there, quietly watching, calculating, and preparing for whatever would come next. Every bump, every jolt, every flash of lightning was met with the same unwavering focus. He remained calm, unshaken, a steady force amidst chaos. And in that quiet, tense air of the cabin, the passengers began to understand that sometimes heroes don't announce themselves. Sometimes heroes simply show up when they are needed the most. The plane pressed on, cutting through the darkening clouds, every mile taking them closer to safety. And as the cabin settled into a tense but steady rhythm, one thing was clear. The flight would never be the same for anyone on board, and neither would the respect for the man in the leather jacket who had quietly claimed it. The plane had been through rough patches, but now a fragile calm had settled in the cabin. Passengers sat quietly, some still gripping armrests, some staring at the clouds outside. The occasional flashes of lightning reminded everyone that the storm outside was far from over, but at least the violent shaking had lessened. There was a sense of awe lingering in the air, an almost electric feeling of relief that someone capable was in control. The man in the leather jacket remained in the cockpit, his focus unwavering. He moved with quiet authority, checking controls, listening to the captain, and making subtle adjustments that only a trained eye would notice. He didn't speak more than necessary. His hands and eyes communicated confidence, and that was enough. Back in the cabin, the whispers had resumed, though now they were tinged with curiosity rather than judgment. Passengers who had mocked his appearance earlier now glanced toward him with uncertainty. Some were apologetic in their own way, realizing that the assumptions they had made were completely wrong. The flight attendant who had escorted him to the cockpit returned to the cabin after a few minutes. She walked past the rows of seats with determined calm. Her eyes flicked toward the passengers as she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. When she passed the businessman who had made the earlier comment about the biker being out of place in first class, he caught her eye and sheepishly nodded. She returned a slight, knowing smile but said nothing. Some lessons are learned quietly. Meanwhile, the man who had been sitting quietly by the window now had another role to play. He wasn't just assisting the captain. He was observing every system, every instrument, every detail that might affect the safety of the plane. His experience as a combat pilot had trained him to react to extreme situations without panic, to think quickly, and to make decisions in moments when hesitation could be deadly. The turbulence still came in uneven bursts. The plane tilted slightly, a sharp jolt moving through the seats, and passengers instinctively tightened their grips on anything steady. But each time the plane rocked, he remained composed. His calm radiated, and even the co-pilot, who had been visibly tense moments before, began to mimic his steady movements, listening carefully to his instructions. A passenger sitting near the front of the plane could not hold back any longer. He had been watching the man intently for several minutes, trying to understand who he really was. "Excuse me," he said softly to the flight attendant as she passed by. "Who is that? He seems different. How does he know what to do?" The flight attendant gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes flicking toward the cockpit door. "He's someone who's trained for moments like this," she whispered, careful not to alarm the passengers. "Just someone you hope is on your side when things go wrong." The man listened to her words and then turned his attention back toward the cockpit, his curiosity growing. Even though he could not see inside, there was an unmistakable sense that the person at the controls was extraordinary. Something in the way the plane's movements began to stabilize gave him hope, a rare feeling in situations that often brought fear. Inside the cockpit, the biker's hands moved almost automatically over the instruments. Years of training and experience guided every motion. Every decision was precise, calculated, and deliberate. He was assessing the aircraft systems while simultaneously advising the captain on the adjustments needed to navigate through the storm safely. "What's your name?" the captain asked, finally breaking the silence. It was not out of casual curiosity. There was a professional respect in his tone, a recognition that this man was extraordinary. He paused for a moment, considering how much to say. Then he spoke, simply and clearly. "I go by the name you see on my ID. That's enough for now. The captain nodded. Understood. Let's keep the plane steady and get everyone through this. It wasn't long before the passengers noticed another change. The plane, which had rocked violently moments ago, now seemed steadier. The engine's hum sounded normal. The sudden jerks had almost disappeared. The lights inside the cabin no longer flickered. Each adjustment made inside the cockpit was being felt immediately by those seated, even if they didn't understand exactly what had been done. A young woman sitting by the aisle glanced nervously at the window as another lightning bolt illuminated the clouds. She reached for the hand of her companion, a man who had been unusually quiet throughout the flight. Neither spoke for a moment, letting the hum of the engines and the occasional jolt carry over them. Slowly, a small sigh escaped her lips, almost involuntarily. There was a sense of relief in the air, subtle but tangible. The man in the leather jacket remained focused on the cockpit instruments. Every flicker of a warning light, every shift in controls, every movement of the plane was assessed carefully. He was a calm presence in a situation that could easily have turned chaotic. The co-pilot, who had been struggling to maintain composure, now worked closely with him, following his lead and trusting his experience. From the cabin, it was clear that the dynamic had changed. The passengers who had whispered about his appearance before now watched him with an unspoken respect. There was a quiet realization spreading through the rows. This was not just a man on a plane. This was someone who had the knowledge and ability to make the difference between panic and safety. A flight attendant approached a nervous elderly man who had been gripping the armrest for most of the flight. "Sir," she said softly, "we have someone in the cockpit assisting. He is highly trained. You are safe." The man nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing just a little. His eyes, previously wide with fear, softened as he looked forward, imagining the confidence and expertise of the person guiding the plane. Meanwhile, the biker's thoughts were focused. He was considering every factor: the weather outside, the turbulence inside, the plane systems, and the coordination with the captain. Each decision had to be precise because there was no room for error. He had been trained to stay calm in situations far more dangerous than this, to act decisively when lives depended on it. Another jolt shook the plane lightly, but it felt different this time. The passengers instinctively braced themselves, but the motion was brief and controlled. They began to notice a pattern. The plane was no longer flailing randomly. Every bump had a rhythm. Every movement was deliberate, as if the aircraft itself had been tamed. A young boy sitting with his parents whispered to his mother, "Mom, is he really a pilot? Or is he some kind of superhero?" The mother smiled gently, holding his hand. "He's someone who knows how to handle danger." "That's close enough to being a hero," she replied softly, glancing toward the cockpit door. The child nodded, eyes wide with wonder, and then returned to his own small seat, clutching his stuffed toy a little tighter. Passengers in the first-class section, who had been initially judgmental, now sat quietly, observing him in awe. They noticed the way the captain deferred to him, the way the co-pilot followed his lead, and the subtle adjustments that seemed to calm the aircraft. The man who had been loud and confident before now seemed smaller, humbled by the quiet authority of someone who had been trained for real danger. Outside, the storm clouds loomed, lightning slicing the sky intermittently, thunder rolling softly in the distance. The plane continued its journey through the darkness. Passengers could see the occasional flash reflecting on the windows, but inside, there was a calm that had not been there before. The biker in the cockpit continued his work. Every movement was methodical. Every check was thorough. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't speak unnecessarily. His calm was infectious, and the cabin seemed to absorb it without realizing it. The flight attendants moved more confidently, attended passengers quietly and efficiently. Even those who had been extremely nervous seemed to relax slightly, trusting that someone capable was in control. A man in a business suit, who had earlier whispered criticisms about the biker, now watched him closely. There was a grudging respect in his gaze. He leaned toward his companion and whispered, "I think I misjudge him, that man knows what he's doing." The companion nodded slowly. "I think you're right, and we're lucky he's here." The child near the front of the plane, who had asked earlier about superheroes, watched the cockpit area with wide eyes. He whispered again to his mother, "Mom, Do you think he's like the pilots in the movies? She smiled gently, squeezing his hand. Maybe not like in the movies, sweetheart. He's even better. He's real. Inside the cockpit, the calm authority of the biker allowed the captain to make decisions more confidently. Every system checked, every adjustment made, brought them closer to stability. The co-pilot followed his instructions precisely, grateful for the steady guidance in such a tense situation. The passengers could not see all the details, but they could feel the difference. The plane moved smoothly now, gliding through the clouds instead of jerking violently. The storm outside was still fierce, but the chaos inside had diminished. A mother sitting near the middle of the plane whispered to her partner, "He's saved us from panic. I don't even know who he is, but I feel safer already." Her partner nodded, voice low. "It's amazing, isn't it? How one person can make such a difference." The young boy who had been asking questions earlier leaned against his mother, eyes wide. "Do you think he's scared at all?" he asked. She shook her head gently. "No. People like him have learned how to stay calm, even when things get really scary." And that was exactly what everyone on the plane was learning that day. Calm confidence and experience could turn fear into reassurance. The man in the leather jacket had done more than stabilize the plane. He had changed the mood in the cabin, replacing panic with hope, judgment with respect, and uncertainty with a sense of safety. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, the cabin had transformed. The passengers were quiet now, watching, waiting, and silently acknowledging the quiet hero at the controls. They had assumed he was just a biker, a man who looked rough and unpolished. But that assumption had been shattered. He didn't boast. He didn't announce himself. He simply did what needed to be done. Every move measured, every decision deliberate, every action calm. And in doing so, he taught everyone on board a lesson about true strength, courage, and quiet heroism. The storm would not last forever, and the journey was far from over. But for the passengers who had spent the last hour clinging to fear and uncertainty, there was now a sense of hope, a steady, quiet hope that came not from luck, not from chance, but from the skill and experience of a man who had faced danger before and was ready to face it again. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone on that plane understood something very important. Sometimes, the people you underestimate the most are the ones who can save you when you need it the most. The leather-jacketed man continued his work in the cockpit, silent, focused, prepared for whatever challenge would come next, while the passengers watched and waited, realizing that appearances are often deceiving, and that true heroes don't always announce themselves. They simply act when it matters most. The plane continued its fight through the storm. Outside, the clouds were thick and heavy, swirling in dark gray and flashes of lightning that illuminated the night sky. Rain hammered against the windows and sheets, bouncing off the wings and creating a constant drumming sound that seemed to echo throughout the cabin. Passengers sat frozen, gripping their armrests, holding their children close, or closing their eyes as if hiding from the chaos outside would somehow make it less real. Inside the cockpit, the man in the leather jacket moved with careful precision. His hands were steady on the instruments, adjusting, calculating, and coordinating with the captain. Each movement was deliberate, smooth, almost effortless. There was no hesitation, no panic, no second-guessing. Years of experience in situations far more dangerous than this guided every decision. The co-pilot, initially tense and unsure, now followed his lead with complete trust, asking questions only when necessary and acting immediately on the answers. The turbulence continued, but it was no longer uncontrollable. The sharp jolts and sudden dips had transformed into steady, manageable movements. Each adjustment made inside the cockpit was reflected in the cabin. Passengers could feel the difference even if they did not understand exactly what had changed. The plane was no longer flailing like a frightened animal. It was responding, listening, guided by someone who knew its limits and how to navigate them. A mother, holding her young daughter tightly, whispered, "It's like magic. How is it moving so smoothly now?" The daughter clung to her mother, wide-eyed and trembling, but a small spark of hope had replaced the earlier fear. Other passengers had noticed similar changes. Whispers floated quietly through the cabin. "Who is that man? How is he doing this? I've never seen anything like it." The businessman across the aisle, who had been judgmental and dismissive earlier, now sat with his mouth slightly open, watching the man in the cockpit with a mix of awe and disbelief. His confidence had vanished, replaced by the recognition that appearances could be deceiving. He leaned back in his seat, silent, realizing he had misjudged the biker entirely. The child in the row near the front tugged gently at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, do you think he's a superhero?" She smiled softly, ruffling his hair. "Not exactly, sweetheart. He's someone who knows what to do when it really matters. That's even better than being a superhero." The boy nodded, eyes glued to the cockpit, mesmerized by the quiet authority of the man guiding the plane. Lightning flashed again, bright and fierce, illuminating the swirling clouds. Thunder followed almost immediately, shaking the cabin lightly. Some passengers instinctively held their breath, waiting for the next jolt, but the plane held steady. It dipped slightly and then leveled out, smooth as glass. Relief spread to the rows like a tide. The flight attendant moved quietly down the aisle, offering water and reassurance. Her voice was calm, steady, conveying the unspoken truth that the situation was under control. Passengers who had been tense for hours finally allowed themselves a small measure of comfort. The anxiety in the cabin was still present, but tempered by the visible confidence of those managing the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the biker worked seamlessly with the captain. Each instruction was precise. Each adjustment, whether small or large, was made with exact timing. He spoke only when necessary, his voice calm and controlled, giving clear, concise guidance. The captain, feeling the steady presence at his side, regained some of the confidence that had been lost when the turbulence first began. "Adjust the stabilizer slightly to the left," the man said softly, his voice almost a whisper but carrying weight. The co-pilot nodded immediately and followed the instructions. The plane responded as expected. The violent jolts were replaced with smooth movements, controlled and predictable. A young woman near the middle of the cabin let out a small sigh of relief, gripping her partner's hand. "I don't even know who he is," she whispered, "but I feel like everything's going to be okay." Her partner nodded, eyes still on the cockpit, watching the calm movements behind the door. "Sometimes it just takes one person who knows what to do," he said softly. "One person to keep everyone safe." The storm outside raged on, but the interior of the plane had transformed. The fear that had gripped the passengers like a vice began to loosen. They still felt the occasional bump or dip, but now they sensed control, guidance, and protection. The co-pilot, who had been shaking slightly when the turbulence first started, now moved with confidence. He checked the instruments, repeated commands back, and made minor adjustments, without hesitation. The captain glanced at him, and then at the man in the leather jacket. There was a silent acknowledgement in his eyes. This was someone extraordinary, someone whose presence made all the difference. In the cabin, passengers began noticing details they hadn't seen before. The smoothness of the engines, the controlled tilt of the wings, the way the plane seemed to glide rather than toss through the storm. It was subtle, but those with sharp eyes and attentive minds could feel it. The difference between chaos and order was palpable. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Mom, how is he doing that?" She smiled, holding him close. "He's trained to stay calm when everyone else is scared. That's why the plane isn't shaking anymore. He knows what to do." The boy nodded, eyes wide with admiration. "He's amazing." The mother smiled again, thinking about the lesson this moment was teaching. Strength doesn't always come from being the loudest or the fastest. Sometimes, strength comes quietly, through knowledge, experience, and calm in the middle of chaos. Outside, lightning flashed again, but the plane's movements barely reacted. The storm was powerful, yet the aircraft seemed to move through it with a sense of purpose, like a boat navigating turbulent waters with an expert captain at the helm. The passengers, who had been tense and fearful moments ago, now felt a sense of trust. Some held their children close. Some stared quietly at the ceiling, silently thanking whoever was in control. Some simply closed their eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling that, for the first time in hours, they could relax even in the storm. The biker remained focused, every motion measured, every adjustment precise. His training in combat aviation had prepared him for situations far more dangerous than a passenger plane in a storm. Every command he gave, Every calculation he made was aimed at keeping the plane steady and guiding it safely through the turbulence. The captain's voice finally came over the intercom, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently navigating through severe weather. We have an experienced pilot assisting us, and the situation is under control. We ask that you remain seated with seatbelts fastened, and thank you for your patience." Passengers let out small sighs of relief. The reassurance, calm and confident, reached them even over the storm. A woman holding her child whispered quiet thanks. A man sitting alone muttered, "I don't know who that is, but I hope he's on every flight I ever take." The storm showed no signs of slowing. Yet inside the plane, a quiet transformation had occurred. Fear had been replaced by cautious optimism. Panic had been replaced by trust. And for the first time since boarding, passengers felt safe in the hands of someone who knew exactly what to do. The biker continued his work silently, seamlessly coordinating with the captain. Every movement was precise, every calculation perfect. The co-pilot had learned from him in minutes what would have taken months in a classroom or years in training. There was a rhythm now, a steady pulse, a quiet certainty that the plane would reach its destination safely. A passenger glanced across the aisle at another and whispered, "He's saving us, isn't he?" The other nodded slowly, voice barely audible. "Yes, he's saving all of us." The young boy watched the cockpit area with wide eyes, still fascinated. "Do you think he's ever scared?" he asked softly. His mother shook her head gently. "People like him know how to control fear. That's what makes them strong." The passengers began to notice the difference in themselves as well. Their shoulders loosened. Their breathing became steadier. Even their thoughts, which had been racing with worry, began to slow. They realized that someone with skill and experience could make a difference, and in doing so, he had given them something they had not felt since boarding: confidence. The plane continued to cut through the storm, lightning flashing in the distance, thunder rumbling softly. The rain pelted the windows, but inside, the cabin had transformed. Calm replaced panic, trust replaced fear, and all eyes, knowingly or unknowingly, were on the man in the leather jacket. The quiet hero who had appeared when he was needed the most. For hours, it could have felt like chaos, but now, guided by his steady hands and calm mind, the flight had become a testament to skill, patience, and quiet courage. Passengers who had judged him harshly now understood what true heroism looked like. It was not in appearances or words. It was in action, in competence, and in the ability to remain calm when everyone else was afraid. The storm continued, but the plane moved through it with purpose and control. Every jolt was met with calculated adjustments. Every flash of lightning outside was met with steady hands inside. And every anxious thought in the cabin was met with quiet reassurance, not through words, but through the presence of someone who knew how to navigate the impossible. The passengers could not see the detailed work happening in the cockpit. They could not see the calculations, the subtle maneuvers, or the split-second decisions, but they could feel the difference. They could sense that the plane was under control. And in that sense, perhaps even more than an actual sight, the man in the leather jacket had already become their hero. Even as the storm raged on outside, the flight was no longer about fear. It was about courage. It was about trust. It was about the knowledge that one person, calm and skilled, could make the difference between panic and safety, chaos and order, uncertainty and hope. And so, the plane pressed forward through the storm, steady and sure, guided by hands that had faced danger before and by a mind that knew exactly what needed to be done, giving everyone on board the unspoken but unmistakable assurance that they would see the sky clear again, that they would survive, and that they would never forget the quiet hero who had appeared when he was needed the most. The plane finally began to descend. The storm had not fully cleared, but the turbulence had eased, and the path to the airport was visible through breaks in the clouds. Every passenger had been holding their breath for hours, and now a quiet sense of anticipation replaced the fear. The steady hum of the engines felt reassuring, like the heartbeat of a giant creature that had been tamed by skill and experience. Inside the cockpit, the man in the leather jacket remained focused. He guided the plane with careful precision, making small adjustments to flaps, monitoring the instruments, and coordinating with the captain. The co-pilot, once tense and anxious, now moved with quiet confidence, following his guidance with trust and respect. Every movement inside the cockpit was calm and deliberate. Back in the cabin, passengers were aware that the plane was approaching its destination. Some began to straighten in their seats, checking that their seatbelts were fastened. Some whispered quietly to each other, still processing the hours of tension they had endured. A few exchanged glances filled with awe and gratitude, though they didn't yet fully understand the man behind the comm. The young boy near the front of the plane leaned toward his mother, eyes wide. "Mom, do you think he's going to make it land safely?" She smiled gently, squeezing his hand. "Yes, sweetheart. He knows what he's doing. You'll see." Passengers began to notice how the plane moved now, smoothly, steadily, almost gliding. The violent shaking that had terrified them for so long was gone. The man in the leather jacket had turned a chaotic flight into something almost ordinary, despite the storm still raging outside. The captain spoke over the intercom, his voice calm but carrying a note of relief. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for landing. We are on a safe approach path. We have an experienced pilot assisting us, and I want to thank you all for your patience." The passengers let out small sighs of relief. Some gripped their seats less tightly. Some leaned back, allowing themselves a moment to relax. A quiet sense of gratitude spread to the cabin, though most could not yet put it into words. The woman holding her child whispered softly, "I don't know who that man is, but he saved us." Her companion nodded in agreement. "Yes, he did. I hope he knows how much he helped." The man across the aisle, the businessman who had judged him earlier, now watched the cockpit with a mix of respect and humility. He had misjudged the biker entirely. He had assumed appearances told the story, but now he knew better. The quiet, focused presence at the controls had been more than enough to navigate the storm. Lightning still flashed outside, illuminating the swirling clouds, and the plane dipped and tilted gently with the remaining turbulence. But every movement was controlled. Every adjustment was precise. Every passenger could feel the difference. There was safety now where there had once been panic, order where there had once been chaos. The co-pilot spoke quietly to the man in the leather jacket. "We're on the final approach. Everything looks good from my side. Thank you for your guidance. I couldn't have managed this alone." The biker nodded, voice calm but not boastful. "We make it through together. Keep focus." The plane moved steadily, cutting through the last of the storm clouds. The runway lights came into view below, small but bright against the darkness. The passengers stared out the windows, some gripping the armrests again, but this time with hope rather than fear. The young boy pressed his face to the window. "Mom, look. The ground. We're going to be okay." She nodded, holding him close. "Yes, we are," thanks to him. The captain guided the plane carefully onto the runway, and the landing was smooth, almost gentle, despite the wind and rain. The tires touched the ground with controlled thud, and the plane rolled steadily down the runway. Every passenger exhaled audibly, some laughing softly, some crying quietly, overwhelmed with relief. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking on passengers, offering smiles, and quietly expressing gratitude to the man in the leather jacket as they passed him. Though he did not smile widely or seek recognition, his calm demeanor remained intact, a quiet anchor for everyone around him. The doors of the plane opened, letting in cool, damp air from outside. Passengers began to gather their belongings. Still in a state of awe, they whispered among themselves about what had just happened, sharing their amazement at the calm, quiet hero who had guided them through the storm. The businessman who had judged him earlier finally stood and walked toward him. I misjudged you," he said, voice low but sincere. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here." The biker nodded simply, just did what was needed. A mother approached him, holding her child's hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "You kept us safe. My son, he's still talking about you." He looked at the child briefly and gave a small nod, a gentle acknowledgement. "Glad you're safe." The passengers began to leave the plane, each carrying with them a sense of respect and gratitude. They had witnessed something extraordinary. They had assumed that appearance mattered, that a rough jacket and weathered hands meant nothing in a modern aircraft. But they had been wrong. True skill and courage had shown itself quietly, without showiness, without need for applause. Even the flight crew expressed their thanks. The captain turned to the man in the leather jacket. I don't know how to properly thank you. Your experience made all the difference. We couldn't have managed this without you. The biker nodded, voice calm. Just part of the job. Someone had to keep everyone safe. Outside, the storm clouds were beginning to break. Rain still fell, but patches of sky were visible through the fading darkness. The passengers stepped off the plane into the wet tarmac, carrying relief and a newfound respect for the man who had guided them through the worst. The child tugged at his mother's hand. Mom, can we say thank you to him? She smiled, holding his hand tightly. We already did, sweetheart, and he knows it. One by one, passengers walked past him, offering quiet thanks, nods of respect, and soft words of gratitude. None of it seemed to change him. He did not seek praise or recognition. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. A young woman whispered to her companion, I hope I never forget this flight. I hope I remember what real courage looks like. Her companion nodded. Me too. It's not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, calm, and steady. The man in the leather jacket picked up his duffel bag and adjusted his jacket. He had no need to linger. He had done what was necessary, and his work was complete. The passengers who had watched him in awe now turned their attention to gathering their belongings and stepping toward the terminal. As he walked away, some passengers looked back one last time. Their expressions were a mix of admiration, relief, and humility. They had learned a powerful lesson. Appearances could be deceiving. True heroism does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, precisely when it is needed the most. The flight crew returned to their duties, checking the plane, preparing it for the next journey. The captain paused for a moment, looking toward the departing man. There was a sense of gratitude and respect that could not be fully expressed in words. Passengers exited the plane into the terminal, sharing stories, recounting the tension, the fear, and the calm authority that had guided them through it all. Their conversation centered on the man who had been their unseen guardian, their quiet hero. A father whispered to his daughter, Remember him, okay? Remember that courage can be quiet. The daughter nodded, eyes wide, holding her father's hand tightly. I will, she said softly. Even the young boy from earlier clutched his mother's hand as they walked toward the terminal. I want to be brave like him one day, he said quietly. She smiled, tears welling in her eyes. You already are in your own way. The man in the leather jacket continued walking, blending into the crowd without fanfare. He did not seek recognition. He did not need it. The lives he had helped guide safely to the ground were their own reward. The respect and gratitude of everyone who had been on that flight were evident in their faces, their words, and their quiet admiration. Passengers who had judged him harshly before the flight now carried a humbling lesson with them. Real courage is measured not by appearance, but by action. True skill is revealed in moments of crisis, when calm and knowledge are more powerful than noise or bravado. The storm outside was fading. The city lights glimmered in the distance, reflecting off the wet ground. The passengers walked toward the terminal, carrying a mix of relief, gratitude, and awe. Each of them had witnessed something extraordinary, even if they could not fully articulate it. The young boy looked back once as the man disappeared into the terminal, whispering, Goodbye, hero. Inside the cockpit, the captain turned to the co-pilot. We were lucky today. More than lucky. That man saved lives. I hope everyone on that plane realizes how extraordinary he was. The co-pilot nodded. I know I do. I've never seen someone handle pressure like that. And outside, the man in the leather jacket walked calmly through the terminal, carrying nothing but his duffel bag and the quiet confidence of someone who had done exactly what was needed. He had no fanfare, no applause, no recognition required. The people he had helped would remember him, though, not because he wanted them to, but because his actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. For the passengers who had mocked, feared, or doubted him, their perspective had changed forever. They had seen firsthand that true heroism could come quietly, from someone who didn't announce themselves, who didn't seek attention, but who acted with knowledge, skill, and courage when it mattered most. And as they left the plane and disappeared into the terminal, the lesson stayed with them. Appearances do not define a person. Actions do. Calm and courage in the face of fear do. And sometimes, The person who seems ordinary is the one who will make the extraordinary difference when you need it the most. The storm had passed. The plane was safely on ground, and lives had been saved. The passengers carried with them relief, gratitude, and a story they would never forget. And the man in the leather jacket, quiet and unassuming, walked on, leaving behind nothing but proof that real heroes act quietly, decisively, and with unwavering courage when it matters most.